there really is this subtext, this undercurrent of a story about power that it goes throughout this entire Easter journey, and it really has something to say about what true power is. The power over death and the grave ends up being something far more profound than the little power structures we see on earth at the time. And I don't know about you, that gives me so much hope about the world we live in right now, that we get wrapped up in these little political power structures that exist on the earth. And we tend to find those being, the insurmountable challenge of the human experience. But we're reminded in the Easter story that there are powers that far transcend these things that seem to occupy our thoughts every day.
Hi, I'm Carol Saunders, host of the Spiritual Forum, where I have extraordinary conversations exploring the vast realms of spiritual living. If you're on a healing, learning, awakening, or intertransformational journey, this podcast will support you. The personal stories, wisdom, and insight shared here will inspire you and give you hope. Step into your divine nature and welcome to the forum. Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad to be with you again. I've brought back my guest from last December, John Bucher, who's a renowned mythologist and story expert. He's been featured on the BBC, the History Channel, the LA Times, the Hollywood Reporter, numerous other international outlets. He serves as executive director of the Joseph Campbell Foundation and is a writer, storyteller, and speaker. John explores mythology as the stories we use to make sense of the world around us. And the world needs to be made sense of. It's crazy. He's consulted and worked with government and cultural leaders around the world, as well as organizations such as HBO, DC Comics, Paramount Pictures, Nickelodeon, and many, many, many more. He brings deep understanding of cultural narratives and myth to a wide variety of audiences. He's also the author of 6 influential books on storytelling. And right now, he is on a speaker tour in Amsterdam. So I'm so glad that you're willing to join me from Amsterdam, John. Welcome.
Carol, it is so good to be with you again. I had such a great time in our conversation that the last time we were together, and it is just a treat to get to be with you and your audience again, and talk about the things that give us purpose and meaning, and the way that we dive into the stories that we live out in our lives. So it's just a treat to get to be with you again.
I feel the same way. Now, just to remind people, you may not or may not remember, I had John on the podcast in December, and we discussed the hero's journey and the importance of mythology in today's world. And we walked through the Christmas story and looked at the mythological symbolism and what does it mean to us today as a timeless story. Today, we're going to be walking through the Easter story, which is just equally as compelling, if not more, than the Christmas stories. So I'm really excited to have you back, John. I think the Easter story is something that we all live in our lives regularly, but we think it's some story from age old and only happened to one person. Symbolically, this story is our story. Before we get into that, though, John, can you share with us, can you remind us why mythology is important at all in today's world and storytelling?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you asked this, because a lot of people, they hear that word mythology, and it can turn them off. They can immediately disconnect and say, "Oh, mythology is not really something I'm interested in. That's about those old Greek gods, and I had to read about that in the 6th grade, and it's just not that interesting to me." And I define mythology much more broadly than that. And when talk about mythology, what we're really talking about are the stories that people use to make sense of the world around them. The way that we use stories in order to explain that which we don't understand. And while in ancient Greece, they told stories about why it got cold sometimes or why it rained sometimes, because they didn't yet have the science to understand, the reasons behind those things. We still tell stories today to try and help us come into relationship with the things that we don't understand. And I don't know about you, but there's a lot about this world right now that I don't understand, and I need these stories to help me make sense of this world that we live in today.
I think I shared the same sentiment in your introduction. The world is does we need to make sense out of it. We need to make sense out of our everyday things that are happening, and we need to make sense out of, where are we in the stories as we grow ourselves, like, spiritually and become, who we were created to be. The Easter story and the Christmas story, I mean, whether you're a Christian or not, especially if you're Christian, these are stories that have been told for thousands of years. But even if you're not, it is in our culture, and there is some story, symbolism that is, I think, available for everyone. It's not really about a religion, and it's not really about a belief. There's metaphors and symbolism, really about our life patterns that everyone could benefit from. So I just hope whoever's listening can be invited into this conversation, no matter what your faith tradition is, or no matter if you have a faith tradition.
Completely agree, Carol. I feel like that Easter isn't just a story about someone rising from the dead. It's part of a much older pattern of imagining how life and meaning and even communities renew themselves after collapse. And if you look across cultures, the universe seems to love one particular plot twist. And that is the moment when everything looks lost and then something breaks through. And Easter is this Christian framing of that idea that is so beautiful and so meaningful. And yes, we've seen this story play out in a lot of different cultures. We've seen, stories. There's certainly the story of Jesus, but we also see in ancient Egypt, we see the story of Osiris. About a deity that rises from the dead. We see in Greek mythology the story of Dionysus, the story about a god rising from the dead. We see the story of Persephone, also in Greek mythology, about someone coming back from the underworld. In ancient Babylonian stories, we see the story of Inanna, another woman who comes back from the underworld. And so there's something that rings true about this story, regardless of what culture we come from, or what the particular tradition that we most resonate with is. And I think this is something really important to remember, is that there's something very universal about this motif and this idea and this story that has something to say to all of us if we have ears to listen.
Think you've made a very important point, because I don't think many people know that the story of rising from the dead or the underworld is kind of a universal story. And that's not to minimize the Christian story, but it is in a context of something that has been told in many, many cultures. And so obviously there's something that we gain from this. And obviously we do, because we all kind of identify with that moment where everything is lost. The Death Star is gonna blow up everything.
That's right.
And then Luke Skywalker finds a way, to allow a new beginning. So let's walk through the Easter story just a little bit to remind everyone. If it's okay with you, I'd like to do a little preamble, what
Okay.
kind of set the stage for the big event,
Yes.
because the Easter story kind of starts with Jesus coming in to Jerusalem through the east gate on a donkey, or some sort of, I think he was a donkey, a foal. And everybody has these palms that are singing Hosanna. So he has a great triumphal entrance in a very humble way. Shortly thereafter, he does some teaching in the temple. He does some major confrontation in the temple with the powers that are, perhaps shouldn't be, but that are. And he sees the temple as being misused, abused by authorities and the money changers and the animal exchange and all of that, and the slaughter. And so he confronts that. He lets the animals free. He confronts the money changers and says, "My temple, should be is been made into a den of robbers," which puts a target on his back. There's other things that happen, but ultimately there's a last meal with his disciples where they celebrate and with bread and wine. And then there's this agony in the Garden of Gethsemane where he has to face his own trepidation, the depth of his own ego. And then we have the arrest and the trials, the crucifixion, the tomb, and the resurrection. So that's kind of a brief recap of the Easter story. Now, where should we dig in? Should we just kind of cover right now the cross, the tomb, and the resurrection, or do you want to start from the very beginning?
I think honestly, this is probably a podcast that could be about 12 hours long because every aspect of this, has so much to dig into. And I think, if we look at the beginning of this story, especially that triumphant entry that ends in a beautiful way, but what's between the triumphant entry and the resurrection is a true difficult road of trials that someone
Mhm.
has to navigate. And I think that's one of the real beautiful parts of this story. And I'm really glad that you brought in this triumphant entry as the beginning of the story, because many times when we think about Easter, we think about, honestly, the crucifixion being the beginning of the Easter story. And it does begin before that. It starts a very happy story, and then it goes dark. And it returns, in the end with this beautiful ending, this beautiful, third act of the story. But I do think in order to get the full picture, we have to start with that triumphant, beginning. And so much of this echoes, these heroic journeys that we see, but also so much of a human life, because you think when we're babies in childhood, we come into this world with a bit of a triumphant entry. We come into this world being celebrated, right? When a baby is born, and there's many, people that celebrate that, and people, congratulate each other, and it's a triumphant entry. And at the end of our lives, hopefully there is this celebration. There's this beautiful moment, at the end that we've run the race well. And between those two events, we know the pain of suffering. We know the difficulties. So, in some sense, I feel like we have to have that full story, because it does mirror so much of the human experience and what a human life truly is.
Yeah, I agree. What I think is so interesting about this entry is of course, from an ego standpoint, it looks like that would be like the height of his life, like everybody has come and, Hosanna, and we just love you. And I don't think that's where Jesus was necessarily psychologically or spiritually, but it sure looks like a peak experience. It sure looks like, wow, you've made it. And life doesn't let us stay there, does it? It,
Yeah.
it brings in these challenges and these trials, some of which we provoke, which he did, and others which just happen to him, which he didn't really have a hand in. Another thing that's interesting about the triumphal entry is, I don't know if you know this, but he came in through the East Gate. Now, the East Gate was considered like the gate of mercy. There's some different names of it. So he came in on this little donkey, and very humbly. Now, traditionally, Pontius Pilate would have come in the West Gate with all of his regalia and all of his, stallions and all of his, his army, in a very ego triumphant entry. Like, this is, look, I've made it.
Yeah.
Whereas Jesus is like, the story juxtaposes these two things:
Yes.
the humility and the actual triumph of humility,
Yes.
and then this huge ego, I'm the power structure and I am living with power over you.
Mm. Ooh. I really love that you've brought this in, because there really is this subtext, this undercurrent of a story about power that it goes throughout this entire Easter journey, and it really has something to say about what true power is. The power over death and the grave ends up being something far more profound than the little power structures we see on earth at the time. And I don't know about you, that gives me so much hope about the world we live in right now, that we get wrapped up in these little political power structures that exist on the earth. And we tend to find those being, the insurmountable challenge of the human experience. But we're reminded in the Easter story that there are powers that far transcend these things that seem to occupy our thoughts every day, and that there are greater powers at work in the world. And I gain so much hope from remembering that.
I think it's so hopeful, and it reminds us where to put our focus. Are we gonna focus on Pilate and all of his artificial power? Are we gonna focus on the power that comes from humility and surrender and to aligning ourselves with the divine presence? And one is, like you said, a real power, the other one is artificial power, and yet so much of our attention is on the power structure of this world and the billionaires and the politicians and the world leaders, and why is this happening? And we put so much energy into that, and it feeds it. It just feeds it over and over again. The story reminds us to come back to the humility, come back to the surrender, come back to the presence of God source, the divine, and that's where our true power is. So it is a great reminder, and not only in these times, in all times.
Absolutely, it really is. And there's something that I think is so worth remembering, because many, of us tend to focus on certain elements of this Easter story. There's this element about uh, escaping death, if you will, and I don't know that for me, Easter is really about escaping death. It's about transforming through it. And that maybe the most important myth that we have right now to hold on to is this idea that we are transformed through the deaths that we go through. And we can romanticize death and say, this death is leading to a resurrection. But we have to remember, death is still a painful experience. It's still horrible when we're going through it. And when we experience the death, whether it be of the death of our ego or the loss of something, that's meaningful to us, there is a pain associated that we tend to not be able to see the resurrection coming. The resurrection is not something necessarily on our mind as we experience death, because we are saying to ourselves, I I'm dying. We're not saying, oh, if I just make it through to the resurrection.
Right,
Death
right.
feels and looks like the end. And I think that that's part of the beauty of the resurrection, is it is this moment that comes when it feels like all has been lost.
Yes. Yeah. Well, before we get too far ahead with the resurrection, I do want to talk to you a little bit about the time that Jesus spent confronting the power structure, because that kind of set him up
Yeah,
for the crucifixion.
yeah, yeah,
So, what do you have to say about that? Because it's like this this man
yeah,
really
yeah,
had a lot of nerve, a lot of courage to go and teach
yeah,
where all the the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes,
yeah,
they're all doing their own kind of teaching.
yeah.
He's there teaching at another level, attracting people at another level. Again, the power is a different power is what's attracting people. And then he confronts the power structure of the temple, because the temple was a money-making, animal slaughtering machine. It was a huge machine. it would be like the central banks today. It would be like taking on something as big as, the Federal Reserve or
Yeah.
beyond that.
Yeah.
And yet this man who rides in with a donkey does this. And I think again, there's some hope and inspiration there that we we don't have to. I think what happens is the stories we sit back and we go, oh, well, someone like Jesus will do it for us. But I think
Right.
we're all called to look at the power structures
Yes.
that are enslaving people
Yeah.
and do what we can with our small, humble voice to turn it over.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point, which is, that in some ways in this story, Jesus is the least likely person to be able to speak to power structures, right? He holds no political power. He is the son of a carpenter. He's not someone who has been passed down the mantle of political voice, and yet it's this least likely person who has more impact than anyone else. And I think I don't know about you, but whenever I see someone who says, "Oh, I'm the least likely person to be able to do this," that's always a sign to me that that may be the person called to do what is required, because there's power to recognizing that it's not you who's going to accomplish this big thing; that you may just be an instrument. Of larger forces. And I think that's one of the things that is so powerful about the story of Jesus, is that Jesus was pointing to something much larger than what people were seeing at the time. People even said, "Who isn't that the son of the carpenter, Joseph?" And yet, what Jesus was pointing to, this larger kingdom of heaven being at hand, it was misunderstood by so many people, and it was uh, misappropriated by others, and it was something that not everyone could wrap their heads around. And I find hope in that as well, because sometimes it feels like um, we too are misunderstood, and we're trying to see something happen in the world, or we're trying to do something in the world, and yet it feels like no one is really getting behind what we're trying to do. People don't see what we're trying to do in the world, and yet that does not stop this beautiful thing from happening. Still, the Easter story continues, even amongst those who had no eyes to see what was really happening. I find a lot of hope in that, because sometimes I feel like I need everyone to understand what's happening around me, so that we can all be on the same page. There's all these people in the Easter story that are not on the same page, and yet it doesn't slow down this beautiful Easter story from continuing to unfold in exactly the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, and exactly what they're supposed to is an interesting way of putting it. I think a lot of people don't want to answer the call when it's like, well, I'm not, I'm the least likely. Boy, I've done that myself. I'm the least likely. Why me? Uh, I think a lot of people don't want to answer that call because what happens next in the story is a lot of suffering. And I think that people see that that's the problem when I stick my head up, my neck up and try to do something to, challenge the power structure. I raise my hand, I put my neck out there, and it's gonna get chopped off, and all these things that are gonna happen. To me to me, everything that happens in this Easter story is a path that's being laid before us. So, like, no matter what happens after you do what you're called to do to challenge the power structures and to also teach about the true kingdom, not the fake power that we live under, that whatever we do, we're going to end up suffering on this plane anyway, right? I mean, none of us escape suffering. But I think the character of Jesus shows us how to walk through it, shows us how to walk through it because the next thing that happens, well, there is the Last Supper, and the Last Supper, I don't know what really happened there. I know what the story says, and I know that there's variations in the story. There's the blood and the wine, and this is my body, and this is my blood. It also could have been a last celebration with friends, saying, this is my last night with you guys.
Yeah.
We don't really know, but it was nice that he was able to be with his friends, even though he knew what was happening next. Then we go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is like its own dark night of the soul. Very, very, very challenging for Jesus in the story. So let's talk a little bit about that, because he kind of awakens.
Yeah.
Well, he might have known all along, but he kind of knows it's imminent
Mm.
now, that this
Mm.
this suffering is now imminent. I've got to walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
And really, will you take this cup from me? He wants to give it up. It's really a fascinating struggle.
Honestly, this is the part of the story I think I relate to the most. Where there's just this moment of, I know this thing I'm supposed to do, but if there's any way I could not have to do it, if there's any way I could avoid it, um, I choose that. I would really like that if there's a way that I could avoid, what it is that I'm supposed to do. I see this in the smallest moments of my life and in the largest moments of my life. And I find such deep comfort that even Christ is having this same experience of saying, "Yeah, I know this thing that I'm supposed to do, but if there's something else, I'd sure choose that." That is so relatable to me, and that moment is one I experience all the time. And, I feel like it's also this heavily mythological moment because we see all of these other stories where this central figure is posed with an impossible task. There's something is asked of them that it's just beyond what could be expected of anyone. And there's a refusal of the call. There's a reluctance to step into it, and yet somehow this whether it's the strength that's summoned or the call, draws them forward, or forces larger than us end up creating a bridge inside of us that allows us to cross over into what we know must be. That beautiful, beautiful experience of vulnerability when we can literally confess and say, I don't think I can go through with this. I just don't know if I have it within me. This is one of the most beautiful moments of this story to me because I feel quite seen as a human being that struggles in this moment. Does that moment hit you the same way?
Oh gosh, yeah, it is such a dark night of the soul. I come to this part of the story a lot in my life, and it makes me kind of wonder in the story. There are different ways to interpret the Gospels, but some people believe that Jesus always knew this was his destiny. Sometimes I wonder if he just really realized it then, like, I didn't know I signed up for this. And we have so many of those times in our life. It's like I signed up to do something and then it all turned on me. That's not what I meant to have happen. That's not what I meant to have happen. But the divine has another plan, and it's really hard to see that I've got to go through this struggle, and I've got to trust that this divine plan, kind of makes sense because I'm the one feeling it.
Yeah.
So there's that part of it. The other thing that we have to remember is at this point, he knows he's been betrayed by a very close friend and the agony
Mm,
of that. So he has the agony of the garden, the
mm,
tears, the please take this cup from me, the agony of being betrayed. He has a foreshadowing sense that Peter is going to deny him.
yeah,
Well, I mean, who wouldn't? Because you saw what just happened to our leader. They're all going to deny him. That's just what we do.
right.
But just to know that that all my buddies here, 3 of them were there with him, and they fell asleep,
Mm,
twice. So it's like I'm really alone, and I think it gets to that point in our spiritual journeys where, you know what? It's just me
yeah,
and God,
yeah,
me and the divine. There's nobody else.
yeah.
Everybody else I count on, they may or may not be there, and likely they won't. And
Mm,
it also reminds me that death is, as birth, it's a solitary journey. We
mm.
have to do it ourselves.
Isn't that true? Isn't it? I mean, in some ways, Easter is this Easter story is a quiet kind of revolution. It's an idea that even the most powerful change doesn't always look like victory at first. Sometimes it looks like loss. Sometimes all we can see is this moment in the garden, this moment, that, as you say, all hope is lost, that um, there's no beauty to be had after this because all that awaits is death. And I appreciate the the finality that we feel in those moments and in this story, um, because it doesn't look like anything good awaits, and yet somehow we know the end of the story that it does. Um, in I think it's so important, that the gospel narratives have included this. This time of doubt and this time of seeing your friends deny you, this time of seeing um, y- every back turned towards you that could possibly be, and we even hear in one account later that God's back is turned, even on Jesus. He can't look at what's happening, and I think that. That really speaks to the depths of how we feel in these moments. Again, we can romanticize these moments, because we know how they end. But in those moments, it's the lowest of the low. It is literally feeling like there's nothing left to pursue. Um, all hope is indeed lost.
And it's also relatable because how many of us escape our life without being betrayed by somebody? Without having people, like, just kind of fall asleep on your message, without having people there when you need them the most, without having people scatter when you need them the most. This is one of the things I love about the story because to me, Jesus shows us how to walk that path when our friends have left us, because we all can relate to that. We all can relate to that. I don't know anybody who hasn't experienced those things with friends and loved ones. And it just breaks the heart. And you still have to put one foot in front of the other and ultimately find your path, not out of it, but through it. So the next thing that happens is he gets arrested, and he's the man who betrayed him is
Yeah,
right there
yeah,
with the arresting parties. So, wow, that's kind of in your face. And then there's this unjust trial. Now, whether this happened in history or not is questionable, but this unjust trial kind of under the darkness of night and under, nobody's watch. And we do know these things happen politically. We know these things happen in these smoke-filled rooms with a bunch of men deciding things for all of us. But in this case, the trial didn't see the light of day. He didn't have a fair trial, and he was condemned. And, he went back and forth with supposedly in the middle of the night, with Caiaphas and Pilate and all of that. The point is, without taking any sides there, or without saying, because we don't have to look at the history, we have to look at the mythology of it, we have to look at the symbolism of it. He had an unjust trial, and he was condemned. And he was condemned to the 40 lashes, which were horrific, and to carry his cross to Golgotha. And then apparently the crowds turned on him. So it was the ultimate continuation of the dark night of the soul. And yet, again, we know what's coming. So we walk in this path. We walk along this path with him, as he carries his cross. And we all feel, again, the lowest of low, so much despair. So now we're at the cross. Now we're at what happens and the death. So let's pick up from there.
Absolutely. There's something that I uh, remain in awe of throughout the the story up to this point, and then especially at this moment of the cross. I often try and put myself into this position, and how would this feel if it were me? And I know I would have been screaming about my own innocence. I would have been fighting back in every moment of this, and in insisting, "You've got the wrong person. This is not, I don't deserve this." And that's what comes up in me. And yet there's this example in the story of seeing the ultimate surrender. And I think there's deep, profound wisdom here. And don't get me wrong, I don't think the story is telling us that it's never appropriate to push back or to fight, or I don't think that's what we take from the story at all. But I think there is a deep wisdom that we experience, that we see in many Eastern traditions and in Western traditions, and it's a universal wisdom that we can discover in the ultimate power of surrender. Saying, I am not going to defend myself in this particular moment and situation. And again, to be clear, there is a moment to defend yourself, and there are moments to push back and fight back. But there are also moments of surrender. And there are moments that we give ourselves over to something greater that is happening. And I think that is one of the moments in this Easter story that I'm deeply challenged by, because I can recognize that would have been a real struggle for me to not throw my hands up, and even to the end as I'm hanging on the cross, to say, this is unjust. This is not
Right.
right.
Right, right. I'm innocent. Even when Judas comes to identify him, he didn't punch him out or anything like that. He's like, everyone put your swords down. You live
Yeah,
by the sword, you die by the sword. I think this idea of defending yourself is really, really interesting. Glad you brought it up, because we do have so many ego defenses. It's crazy. We're not even aware of them. But I think sometimes when I see footage of, like, the Holocaust, when I see footage of people who were held hostage and, their throats are slashed, or I don't wanna get into the gore of this, but the idea, my little ego goes, "Man, why aren't they fighting?" "Why don't they could be biting their ankles, they could be," "Then why aren't they fighting? They could be doing something." And then I think about, how do I want my last moment to be, where do I want my energy to be? Do I want it to be in fighting and making a case that I'm innocent? Because if that were the case, the story would have been written so differently, I think. And
yeah,
we would have looked at the event so differently. We
yeah,
would have remembered that guy who's not carrying his cross, but the one who's, screaming and yelling at the crowd and the everybody,
yeah,
that's what we would have remembered.
yeah.
And so I completely agree. There's times to push back. Obviously, Jesus chose to push back in the temple
Right,
with his teachings and
right,
his calling out the money changers and his
right.
freeing the animals. So he did choose to do that. In this case, he knew what was happening,
Yeah,
and he knew what was imminent. And sometimes, no matter how much we scream, it's going to happen anyway.
that's right.
So then, who do I want to be in this moment?
Mm,
Do I want to demonstrate what putting my personal will under divine will looks like? Do I want to demonstrate what universal love is for everyone, even those who have turned against me, even those who are beating me? That's what he really showed us. I
mm,
can love everybody anyway. Again, so much hope, but so much inspiration.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because the hope we see demonstrated in this story, it suggests that hope isn't naive. It can also be disciplined. It's the choice to trust that something can emerge even when you can't see it yet. And I think that's the moment we see here, whether or not Christ knew resurrection was around the corner or not, there's this powerful choice of trust, that there was something larger happening. And even though he was unable to see it in that moment and was feeling all the pain of it and was literally dying, there still is a choice to choose that something larger is at work here, and I am going to give myself over to it. And in that, I not only find inspiration, I find deep sacred awe and recognition that um, those moments do sometimes create a difficult invitation for us, but that it is possible to choose trust, even when it looks like there's no reason to.
An orientation towards life. As you were talking, I was reminded when I started my church, I don't have it anymore, but I started a church in 2010. And one of the things that I did is I printed these bumper stickers with the church name on it. And the bumper sticker wasn't the church name, that was just a little, byline. The bumper sticker said, "Something wonderful is about to happen." And it was just a message, because when you have that orientation towards life, then when you are in the Garden of Gethsemane, when you are being beaten, when you're carrying your cross, when you're on your cross, if you're living with this something wonderful is about to happen, you're attracting that to you.
Mm.
And something wonderful, I believe, will happen. It does when you have that orientation towards life. That's just kind of an aside. I love those bumper stickers.
I love it.
Okay, so now we're at Golgotha. We're at where there are two presumed thieves that are on their crosses, and Jesus is laid on his cross. Crucifixion just looks so brutal. I just don't even know what kind of mind could have ever even invented that. I mean,
Mhm.
what man, I feel sad for that person, because whoever came up with that, wow. So then, he is on the cross in between these two thieves, and so much more. He continues to teach everybody. He continues to walk the path and show everyone, because again, he is focused on forgiveness and love, even in this torturous circumstances in the last hours of his life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's um, such interesting conversation happening here between the story of these two thieves, that are both witnessing and experiencing the same thing, that Christ is experiencing. And isn't it interesting, the different response of the two thieves? One of the thieves sees what's happening, sees the choice to trust something larger, and says, "Hey, I think I see what's happening here. And when you go into paradise, if you would remember me, I would love that." And this other thief takes a different approach, and chooses not to see this larger thing that's happening. And this moment, we can see Christ's recognition that there is a larger story happening here, in saying, "Today you'll be with me in paradise."
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
th-
big promise.
yeah, big promise. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
look like there's any paradise
Yeah,
right
it's
around the
not
corner.
looking good. At this
No,
point, it's really not looking good.
no.
And the last words of Jesus on the cross, we think they're I didn't write them down all, but we think that he said all these things. In Mark and Matthew, that all of them have, at Luke, they all have different phrases that they have Jesus saying on the cross. One of them will have him say, "Why have you forsaken me?" Another one will say, "John, please take care of my mother." And so they have him say different phrases. Just like the Christmas story, where we combine the narrative of Matthew and Luke and we think it's that story, we've put all of these last words together. But it is interesting to think that he did feel forsaken. It's interesting to think. I have a hard time, believing that God just forsook him, because I think that God is alive within every person. And so
Right.
how can that ever leave you? But the
Right.
idea that you feel that,
Yeah.
you feel that in that moment, you feel that. And, you again, just like not being defensive, like I'm innocent. Again, it's not like, "Why have you forsaken me? I did all this for you. I did this, and this is what you do." That's
Yeah.
what our egos would do,
Yeah.
you know? And
Absolutely.
again, it's just kind of a bearing of all of the feelings and allowing all of the feelings to be fully experienced in the body, and
Yeah.
I would say released, because it seems like he had so much power over the soul, releasing his soul
Yeah.
into your hands. I commit my spirit,
Yeah.
now I am finished. It is finished. He knows his things. And so to have that kind of command over the body and soul, he had to have this complete command over his thoughts and feelings,
Mm.
not avoiding them,
Yeah.
feeling them and releasing them and walking through them to
Yeah.
the other side. It's fascinating.
It really is. And that moment of feeling forsaken. Again, this is one of the moments that I relate to so deeply in this story, that I resonate with and say, I feel that sometimes. I feel like every good force in my life has left me and is ignoring me. And the response is despair. It's anger. It's feeling like I've done all this, and yet there seems to be no recognition of that. And in that moment, death. Um, I'll tell you, Carol. We focus, in the Easter story on Good Friday, and we focus on Easter Sunday. But mythologically, I think the most interesting day might be Saturday.
Yes, it's
It's
the
that
biggest thing that happens in the story.
it's that
Yeah.
in between space where, in some ways, through a lot of people's eyes, it seems like nothing is happening,
No,
and that's where
everything
many
happens
people are.
there. Yeah.
Everything is really I mean, the whole crux of the story is what happened Saturday, really. And that, I think, is unseen by so many, people. And that's where many of us actually live, is feeling like, oh, wait, there looks like there's nothing happening, but actually everything is happening in that moment.
Yeah, that's the place of transmutation. And when I led my church, I love doing Easter services, but I would talk about tomb time.
Mm.
So there's this death. So metaphorically or metaphysically, we experience deaths. Apostle Paul said, "I die daily." I don't agree with a lot of things Paul said, but I do agree with that. We die constantly. And when we die to an older form of ourself, we don't just step into the new form of ourself. We have this void in between that I would call the tomb time. Like, you've got to sit in the tomb, because
Yeah.
that's where the transmutation happens. That's where the caterpillar goes from caterpillar to butterfly. It doesn't just do that instantly. There's this whole metamorphosis that happens there. And for me, I would tell people that this is this in between time, the void. It's a space where you have to just endure the uncomfortableness of the nothingness that seems to be happening, but this is where you allow the divine to touch you and to try transform your very being. To me, that's what tomb time is.
I mean, we think of the tomb as being the symbol of an ending, right? But
Mhm, mhm.
mythically, it functions almost more like a womb. It's this dark enclosed space where transformation's happening and something new is being born, and it's necessary, right? It's necessary for what is still to come. And I love that would give that angle as you talked about this story, because that is also something that's deeply hopeful to me, to recognize those moments where It seems like the ground is frozen over, and it will never ever produce life again. In the dead of winter, it is difficult to see spring, and yet, as Easter occurs in the spring, we're reminded every year through the passing of the seasons of this death and resurrection story, just by walking outside and looking at nature, where it's revisited time and time again.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, the seeds in the ground, they have their tomb. No, I can call it womb time now. Womb time. It it rhymes. It is essential for new beginnings. It is the most essential place. And in this story, the in-between space is only a day. In other stories, it could be weeks, months, years. The point is there's something between death and new life. There's something between that. And nature shows us this, but it applies to us too. It applies to us too. And it's a place of waiting and trusting and knowing that again, as you said many times, something bigger is happening here. And I am a willing participant and I'm an active participant. But in this space, my palms are open and I'm open to the transmutation of the divine. And I use the term transmutation instead of transformation. I think they're probably exchangeable, interchangeable. But I like transmutation because it's such a it's alchemy, it's like it's
Great word.
really changing one thing into another. It's not just, well, I've changed, from one kind of being to a better being, it's really changing,
Yeah.
making a huge change.
Yeah.
So yes, this tomb time, oh, it's just so essential. So I'm glad you feel the same way. The whole story really rests in the willingness and the trust and the faith in that space
Right. That's right.
for
It
all of
really
us.
does.
Yeah.
It really
Yeah.
does.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So unless there's anything more to say about the tomb, uh, then the next day, you know, everyone is in despair. All of his followers that have scattered, in their not so loyal ways, but understandable because
Right.
when your leader's killed, they're coming after you next.
That's
So
right.
I don't blame them. I would probably do the same thing,
Right.
especially if you have wife and kids at home. Come on, you
That's
got to
right. That's right.
got to preserve yourself. And you got to preserve yourself so you can have a voice going
Yeah.
forward. So I completely understand all that.
Yeah.
But still, they've been following this person, this leader. They've been following this person who was the Christ in their eyes, and now he's dead. It's
Yeah.
like, wow, like they have to have been really thinking about, was this whole thing a mistake? Were we wrong?
Right.
What what was that? I mean, that had to be just cataclysmic in their psyches. Just a
Yeah.
lot of questioning.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think it had to be such a confusing time. And then what I love is that the women come to the tomb.
Mm. Yeah.
People take note. It is the
Yes.
feminine
That's
that
right.
is always willing and standing in another space to welcome the next phase, to welcome the new
Yes.
beginning.
Yes. That cannot be lost on us. There's
Yeah.
this story, sometimes the details really matter here. And, it's not Peter, it's not John, who
Yeah.
shows up that morning at the tomb and who gets to witness that moment that will transform everything. Um, it is the enduring presence of the feminine that returns here, and it plays such an essential role in witnessing what has happened, and comes to be the first to communicate that. There's we could say so much about why that is, and why that's important. But I think it is one reason, that comes up, at least for me, is I see that as the there are disciples that will go on and start the church, right? And they will have this role in being a voice, but there's this sacred moment where, the angel is going to appear and say, that Christ is not here. He's risen. And I think that there is a coming together in the sacred moment where the feminine has to be present in this sacred moment. And mythically, for me, that is really exciting because the presence of the feminine in these sacred times has been something I've experienced, but personally, and it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and it's necessary.
It is important to remember that it's not just women, it is the feminine within us. So
That's
for
right.
all you men out there, we're not saying you have no space in this story at this time. It is the feminine within each of us that is really willing to see something beyond what is the obvious, so they're the first and they come back to the disciples and say, "Hey, he's risen." And they're like, "What?" They're still in their slumber. They're still in their everything sucks kind of moment, and not able to see or allow themselves to believe. So I think it's important to know that it is the feminine within us that leads us into a realization. And if we have blocked our feminine nature, whether we are male or female, it doesn't matter. If we've blocked that energy, we've really lost out on our ability to see the magic of life. The tremendous magic of life, and there's so much of it.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
So, that's basically the story. There's other things, doubting Thomas and Jesus's appearances and all of that. But something what I always used to tell people, whether you believe in the literalness of the story or not, something happened that was so dramatic that shifted these scaredy cat disciples, like, running to the edges of wherever they could go, not standing up for their leader, their friend, their rabbi, to s something happened so profound that shifted them into people of courage that started some new movement, and that's not easily done.
Oof.
It's hard to kinda herd cats into a movement, and we know that the Christian movement took lots of forms in the early couple few hundred years, but those disciples, and I would say the women too, because Jesus always had the women with him, they were probably disciples as well. They were so moved by something that they completely had their own, transformation experience and got the courage to speak publicly and to teach and to do their best to walk in the footsteps of the Christ and to be as Christ-like as they could.
I think you're exactly right, and whether you approach this story, theologically or mythologically, I think Easter persists because it speaks to something deeper than doctrine. It speaks to the human need to believe that renewal is possible and that there's a way to see something better than what we began with, even when we go through really difficult, impossible deaths. And even in our own personal lives, as we experience these ego deaths that are so essential to our own individuation and our transformation into better versions of ourselves and living better stories, it is so important to recognize that we are all in this process of life, death, and resurrection. And I'm thankful for that because who I was 7 Johns ago is different than the John that is sitting here with you right now. And I am thankful for that process that continues and continues and continues, bringing out the best of me and better versions of me still to come.
Yeah, I love that. My husband and I will be celebrating our 45th wedding anniversary this year.
Wow.
But what's so interesting is he talks about how many wives he's had. He says, I've been married so many times. They've all been to the same person, but she's changed so many times. The Carol he married is not the Carol he's got today. And I've gone through at least 12, 15 transformations since then. And we all do that. I
Yeah.
hope we do that.
Yeah.
If we're the exact same, then we haven't really lived our life. And so this is really a story for all of us. The death, tomb, and the resurrection and everything that led up to that. It's a story for all of us. I think there's another thing that happens here because I think that the story, perhaps the other stories that you mentioned also in mythology, but it really takes the bite out of your fear of death. If you're really, really paralyzed by that, which so many people are, and so many people say they're not believers, so they don't believe it. I don't care if you're a believer. To me, it's not a belief. It's
Right.
an
Right.
experience of the divine, an experience of the story. It's experience of what I believe is the truth.
Hmm.
So this fear of death that drives so many of us in every aspect of their life, this story also says, fear not,
That's
fear
right.
not. There
That's
is
right.
something beyond.
Mm. I love that. That's such a wonderful admonishment for us, even as in this moment, that
Yeah.
as we, look at our world today, and it's easy to become afraid. It's easy to think, the our political enemies are going to bring about our death, and artificial intelligence is going to take my job, and there are all of these reasons for fear to drive our journey. And in the Easter story, we're reminded that there are greater forces at work than those which strike the greatest fear in us. And sometimes, if we just wait and watch, Saturday will eventually end and Sunday is on the way.
You just tied a bow on our conversation. A nice little bow. I think we've said pretty much all of it. I just think this was so much fun to walk through this story. I love this story, and I think we've left a few things on the table. There's always a few aspects of a story we left on the table, but I also believe we kinda highlighted the most important things that hopefully everybody who's listening can, just like the hero's journey, find yourself in the story. And remember, this is not just the story of Jesus of Nazareth. This is our story. And in the story, the protagonist shows us how to walk the path of our story. And yes, Sunday will come if we stand in faith and we know that there's something much bigger going on. Such a great reminder. Thank you so much, John. This was great.
Thank you, Carol. It's always a delight to be with you and to explore these ideas. It's such a treat.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. If you have any other thoughts about the Easter story, put them in the comments because both of us will visit the comments and we can talk about it there too, or do another podcast at a later time. I just love this. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, John. And I now close the Spiritual Forum. Happy Easter. Thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard here, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, or a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. You can also sign up for my weekly newsletter or make a donation to support this work at thespiritualforum.org. Tune in every week and remember, you are a divine creation, perfect and whole, just as you are.